Hi, I'm Whelan from Rutgers University Department of Environmental Sciences. I study compounds in the atmosphere that get at some of the more elusive things that are happening on Earth's surface. So let's get oriented to the atmosphere for a minute. Just take a deep breath. There, we just exchanged some gases with the atmosphere. Most people think of breathing in oxygen and breathing out CO2. But there are some other things that are happening there. Like if I detected methanol in your breath, I would know that you had eaten an apple in the last day. Some people have organisms in their mouths that produce dimethyl sulfite, which is a component in the taste of cheese and beer. But also if you dilute it, it's the smell of the ocean. And then there are some other things, like if you had hand lotion or hand sanitizer on. There are also organisms that live in between your toes and in your belly buttons that emit some specialized compounds. So this is kind of the cocktail of chemical compounds that you're emitting that says something about you and your experience and the processes that you're experiencing. I study something called carbonyl sulfite, which says something about trees, specifically about how much photosynthesis is happening on land. So how much of the greenhouse gas CO2 we're taking up and putting it into land ecosystems. So this is elusive because while plants are taking up carbon, they're also using some of that sugar that they're fixing and returning it to the atmosphere as CO2, a little bit of it. And then soil microorganisms are also taking some of the leftovers and eating it and respiring and turning that back into CO2. And so if you just measure CO2, you're not getting the full picture. You need to use one of these other more interesting compounds to really get at it. Now it's even more complicated than all that because the wisdom of trees is so different than the wisdom of humans. A tree can change its body in response to the circumstances that it finds itself in. So if you have a leaf, you're building a leaf where it's really sunny versus building a leaf where it's really shady, these two leaves are going to be really chemically different. So it's interesting because Jesse Montgomery's Caught by the Wind changed my perspective in thinking about what trees are really experiencing. So she said that the piece was inspired partially by this twisted branch that she found in the woods. So it's from some old tree that had seen a lot of seasons, and so there's a lot of that kind of thrumming seasonality in this piece. But there are these moments that are kind of terrifying, because if you think about it, a tree is really powerful. It's the main source of carbon, and it determines what lives and dies in its own domain. So there's this powerful component to it, and also this kind of, wearing component to it, where you're kind of being worn down by the spiral of time. So we're very interested in figuring out how much photosynthesis is happening, because currently land ecosystems take up about 1/4 of the CO2 that's emitted by burning fossil fuels, and we'd like to know how much of that we can anticipate relying on in the future, especially under climate change. So how do we combat climate change? Oftentimes people ask me about carbon offsets. The idea of a carbon offset is that if you burn carbon and emit CO2 or methane in one place, you can store it in another place, take it out of the atmosphere in another place, because CO2 is pretty stable in the atmosphere, and it's all one big fluid envelope, right? And so what do you do? So carbon offset programs are really complicated. There's no global standard to tell you that one is better than the other. The other problem is that if you're giving a company $1 to plant a tree, this new tree might be burning through a lot of the sugar that it's producing, and being a net emitter of CO2 to the atmosphere for, depending on the species, maybe a couple of decades. So your carbon offset isn't necessarily going to really take effect for a couple of decades. And you have tree plantations, you're sacrificing biodiversity and having other unintended consequences. So, well, what do you do? So we're already part of this cultural movement that's changing the values of our society. And that's kind of the crux of it, right? So we need to change the values. And this has been happening since, Silent Spring, probably earlier. But it never seems like it's happening fast enough. And so one of the things that you can do is pay $1 to have a company plant a tree. because you're telling the universe that that is something that is important to you. So thank you very much.